I thought I would start by giving like a very broad, and I'm using the word broad, like extremely broad overview of political Islam or political thought in Islam, right? Um, I think that's a good place to start to give us a little bit of background, and then we go to Afghan history and try to map this on Afghan history and especially the history of state in Afghanistan. So one thing to keep in mind is that although maybe in today's world it appears as if um, Islam and the state or those in power, the rulers, are very much in the Muslim context are very much aligned and are very much kind of reinforcing each other. Maybe that's the impression some of you might have gotten. Historically, the relationship has been very uneasy between jurists, the scholars of Islam, those who claim to be custodian of knowledge that made up the Islamic tradition, right? Like jurists, theologians, and such, and early members of the Islamic community, those who were around the Prophet, the companions of the Prophet. They had a very uneasy relationship with the political ruling authorities. And it has to do with a kind of a civil war that happened right after the Prophet passed away. So, as you know, Islam started with Prophet Muhammad, and as soon as he passed away, there was a rift in the community, and that rift, you can think of it as a civil war, put kind of political thought in Islam in a very precarious position, right? And that precarious position has had both theological and kind of political ramification in terms of political philosophy. First of all, theologically, since they were very close people to the Prophet, like people who Muslims thought were the best of the people, they started fighting each other. The question arose theologically as to who was right. Can we pass judgment on someone's actions and basically decide whether they were good Muslims or bad Muslims, good people or bad people, based on what they did, right? Even though what they did might have been based on a sincere belief in that what they were doing was right. Okay, so in a sense, the question was, can you judge, have like objective standards about right and wrong in the political sphere, and use that to judge people's actions and say this group is wrong and this group is right? You can imagine if the Islamic tradition or Islamic community came to theologically, theologians and jurists, the legalist kind of legal minds, if they came to the conclusion that you could, yes, have an objective set of criteria that you could apply to people's actions and therefore conclude that what they did was right or wrong, especially in political sphere when they were challenging a political authority or trying to establish a new political authority, then they would have to basically conclude that some of the best people around the Prophet were wrong on a very, very deep level, and they were just bad Muslims and bad people. And some others were right, because there was literally a civil war. It could not have been that they both could really survive with their reputation intact. And that was a very difficult position for the early community to be in. The synthesis that arose theologically and jurisprudentially was that we're going to defer on this question to afterlife, to Allah. In a sense, they concluded that it was not something that can be decided, whether actions taken by the early generation on political issues would make them good people or bad people, good Muslims or bad Muslims. They basically said, we're going to defer this to afterlife, right? So they became a little bit, and they kind of, the early DNA of Islam, there was a level of, if you think about it, political neutrality or kind of aloofness to the political sphere. They understood that people will, and good people, good Muslims, will, for good reasons, would engage in political contestation. And they were hesitant to bring jurisprudence and theology as a way to arbitrate those political contestations. So in a way, you can think of it as some level of pacificity or some level of distance between the early kind of conception of Islamic jurisprudence and theology and the political question, right? If you want to think of it in modern sense, they kind of came up with political question theory, that some issues are not meant to be adjudicated theologically and jurisprudentially, and they're just going to be left in the political sphere for those in power or those who want to challenge them to figure it out, right? Through means of force if necessary. And they kind of refrain from passing judgments on theologically and jurisprudentially to arbitrate those questions, right? So Islam is started by that aloofness or that distance, right? Islamic theology and Islamic political thought. It started with that kind of a distance. Right? There were some who were unhappy with this, and they wanted the jurisprudential class, the theologians to get more involved, and especially those in power sometimes wanted more support from them. They wanted them to endorse them more wholeheartedly, and they wanted to use the theology and jurisprudence in their favor to cement their power. Right? And Abbasid, that's one of the early empires in Islam, were one of those. They were very keen to shape the knowledge in the Islamic world, the religious knowledge, as a way to support their political projects, right? But they even though they had an influence, they could not really displace that foundational neutrality on political question that had become part of the DNA of Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic theology, right? And that was kind of the norm, that what people consider traditional Islam, that is the Islam prior to a time where Islam came under threats from external forces, like when you have Islamic tradition that is not in threats from external forces. And I don't mean like physical threat. Islamic civilization has been in war with many different civilizations over the years, but I mean like intellectual threats. There was really no intellectual threats for a very long time. And during that time, the traditional Islam had this formula where the ruler would come to power, sometimes by force, sometimes through other means. And as long as they did respect some basic boundaries of Islam, the ulama or the religious class would just basically defer to them. They would kind of let them do the thing. The ruler would get some powers to interfere in social lives, mostly in areas of organizing public life. And we are talking about a pre-modern context. So Islamic state is very limited. And a state means, the word dawla means mostly executive power. Legislative power is not part of the state. Legislative power belongs to the religious class, to the learned jurists who opine on matters of law. The state would set up some courts and appoint some judges, but those judges would determine facts and apply the law as it is articulated by the jurists and muftis to the facts. So judges are not lawmakers. The law is kind of developing by this autonomous class of clerics and learned jurists that are more or less independent. They have their own madrasas. They are dependent more on the society and the support they receive from the society to actually function. So they're not really part of the state. So in that small state, even the ruler has some power, executive power. There are some boundaries to that executive power. The ruler has to do certain things and cannot go beyond those things. But within that boundaries, he's just kind of left to do whatever he deems fit. That was kind of the arrangement for a very long time. That's kind of a political distancing from political question. And I don't mean that they were not involved. Some of the jurists, Muslim scholars, were actually actively challenging some authorities, but they did not bring jurisprudence and theology to arbitrate those deep political questions. They did not pass, for example, fatwa or opinion as to which ruler was legitimate and which ruler was illegitimate as a matter of course. They kind of stood out of it, and it had to do with the initial civil war moment. That was kind of the case. Again, we are sketching a very broad picture until Islam came under threat by external forces. And the first external force was actually Mughals, right? And during this time, you had this figure called Ibn Taymiyyah, and a drawing of him, I think an imagined drawing of him is what you see. This person was kind of one of the first people who agitated against the political neutrality of Islam. He's one of the first people who kind of, in the face of Mughal threats, tried to reformulate this traditional arrangement. And his theory was that Mughals, these are an external force. They are an external threat to the Islamic civilization. They claim to be Muslims. Mughal actually had converted to Islam, but they're not really acting according to the precepts of Islam. And therefore, they need to be fought, and their rule need to be resisted. So he believed, basically, that there was a theological test or a jurisprudential test that could be applied to Mughal that would basically render them not good enough Muslims to be rulers, or not Muslim enough to be rulers, or just not Muslims, and they were therefore compel Muslims to fight them, right? So, like, basically, right to revolution or right to resistance, right, against someone who could otherwise claim political authority, because Mughals really had the power, like physical power, something that prior to Mughals would entitle others to rule the Muslim world. They could get that, but Ibn Taymiyyah was kind of coming up with this argument that no, that doesn't give them the right to rule, and he was very keen to develop a sophisticated philosophy of thought, political philosophy, kind of political jurisprudence, to say no, there is a right to resistance, there is a right to challenge these rulers, they're not Muslims enough, we can judge them by their actions, right? So he was kind of one of the first figures to come up with the kind of, to challenge that traditional kind of deference that the religious class had to the political space, right? The limited political space of pre-modern time. We're not talking about nation state that controls everything. We're talking about just a ruler that has some executive power. There was a lot of deference, and he kind of tried to rewrite that, Ibn Taymiyyah. That's why he's a very central figure, even in modern Islamist circles. They kind of go back to him a lot, because he's kind of one of those early figures who was very intellectually sophisticated, who came up with a challenge of kind of political neutrality of the earlier jurisprudence or earlier jurists, right? So that was kind of the first one. He did not win a lot of support among the other scholars. The traditional method, kind of the traditional principles survived. His views were not the dominant views, so he had some maybe students, but he did not become mainstream. Then you have the second encounter, the second wave of external threats to Islam, and that's colonial encounter. You have to realize that Islam encountered colonialism and modernity at the same time. So they're kind of together. The modern encounter and the colonial encounter go together. And that was very violent. That kind of uprooted the established political institutions in Islam. The civilization came under threat. The knowledge system came under threat, because, you know, modernity with itself brings a form of knowledge, a new political tradition, and a new set of values, right? So everything came under threat. And that second threat kind of, again, challenged the traditional Islam. There were kind of different responses to this, and those continue today. One is a traditional response, which has been more or less accommodating. But even, for example, if you look at India, which was an Islamic system, Mughal were a very famous and influential Islamic empire who were very influential in India. So big part of India was very, very much integrated into the Islamic civilization. When the colonial threat came, the ulama were not very, they were anti-colonial in the sense that they were critiquing the colonial powers to the extent possible, but they were not really overtly political in the sense that they were not calling to overrule the colonial rulers. There were some moments where traditional forces came to do that. They rebelled against the colonial rule and established their own form of political system. Something that many people claim was the original Taliban, because there was an old group of religious scholars who took power and tried to govern an area by themselves, which kind of was not very, did not have many precedents in Islam. So there was some moments, but generally the traditional response to colonialism was accommodation to the extent possible. They focused on knowledge, they were critical in certain areas, but more or less was accommodation. Another response was the Islamist response. The Islamists were very much of the opinion that the reason colonial powers controlled Muslim land was because Islam as a civilization had declined. They wanted to reform Islam, and the way they wanted to reform it was they wanted to make it more rational, and they wanted to get rid of what they considered to be irrational superstitions. They wanted to revive the Islamic kind of knowledge system and all those things. And they were very much in support of the many things about modernity, its rationality, its technology, even its political system. They embrace the democracy, for example, to a certain extent. they embraced a lot of political institutions of modern time. They just wanted to Islamize it. And they considered Islam to be like a political ideology, like communism and others, that could actually be used and implemented through nation state. So you can have a nation state, you can have modern sciences, you will orient your sciences and your state using the Islamic ideology, right? Islam was not a tradition of rules for them. Islam was kind of a set of values, like a political ideology, right? That is the Islamist response. They've been very influential in many places in short Islamic history, and they are still around in many countries. And the other response was Salafi response. Salaf just means the early generations. These people really thought that the traditional Islam had gone wrong, and they had to go back to the earlier generations as a way to defend themselves against the colonial encounter and against the corrupting effect of modernity. So they were not very happy with the way this tradition had evolved past the first couple of generations. For example, they were very critical of the political neutrality that had become part of DNA of traditional Islam, and they wanted much more strict, much more inflexible kind of iteration of Islam. For example, they were very much keen that people's actions determine their fate. So even though in early generation of Islam, there was a conclusion that you cannot judge a person's action, cannot judge a person's fate based on their action, and call them Muslim or non-Muslim based on that. The Salafis were very much clear that you could create boundaries and based on actions call someone Muslim and non-Muslim. Like basically, they wanted to police and be much more strict, morally police the boundaries of who would count as Muslim, right? This is again at a time where everything is kind of declining, right, through the colonial encounter with modernity. Okay? That is where we are right now. Salafists tend to be the views that shape a lot of what in the West people call fundamentalist Islam, which is obviously a problematic term, but a lot of groups that claim that actually Muslims are complicit in all the corruption that happened in the Muslim world, and they want to kind of basically rid Islam of these bad Muslims first before they attend to the Western kind of invaders. Those are kind of the Salafist flavor of theology and jurisprudence. Islamists tend to be more modernist. People, for example, in Tunisia, in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood tend to be Islamist. And traditional Islam is still part of people's lives. And when it comes to political space, you can see examples of it when it has a will to power, when it wants to control a state and rule through the state. The examples of it would be Iran and now Afghanistan under the Taliban. That's kind of an overview, the map of the political Islam or political thoughts in Islam. Obviously, we are synthesizing millennia of intellectual history here. Any questions, reactions, anything that you want to add or share or ask before I talk about Afghanistan?
Do you have anything?
That'd just be a useful background to have. If you wanted to summarize it, just keep in mind that there was Islam at its moment due to a civil war became Islamic kind of jurisprudence and theology became a little bit distanced from the political question. Through some external threats, that position was reconsidered by some who wanted to change it. And when the encounter by the West happened, the kind of the colonial and encounter with modernity happened, there was a fraction. Some wanted to preserve the traditional way and kind of be accommodating towards these changes because they did not see Islam as as all over political project that needed to reshape the society. They just wanted to remain parochial in their focus, the traditional focus. Some said, let's go back to the early generation and just rewrite the whole tradition. Tradition had gone wrong by being too flexible and too accommodating and too loose. And some others were like, no, modernity is a good thing. Rationality, sciences, all these are good things. We can use Islam as a goal point, an ideology, as an orientation, as a political ideology, but all the institutions of modernity should be actually incorporated because we want to be not falling behind the West, right? Kind of the major responses out there, intellectually speaking. Okay. I cannot see clearly, but I imagine there's no questions, so I can move on. Ustad?
I think there's no question right now.
Okay. So now, what about Afghanistan, right? Especially what is about state in Afghanistan, right? There is one initial point I would like to make, that where would you start, right, to tell the story of a state in Afghanistan, Afghanistan state? And one thing you need to keep in mind is that the story we have, the standard kind of the story about Afghanistan's history, is actually a colonial production. The person who founded Afghanistan as a field of study in Anglo sphere, in the English-speaking world, was this figure. You can see his photo here. His name is Elphiston, and he was a colonial officer sent to the Afghan king. At the time, Peshawar, which is now part of Pakistan, was the winter capital of the Afghan state, or the Afghan kingdom. He called it the Kingdom of Kabul, and he did not use the word Afghanistan in that sense. But the story he came to tell about the pedigree of that king, because he did not meet who he claims was the founder of Afghanistan. He did not meet that. He met his grand kind of no, actually, I think he met his Shah Shuja was his son, or Ahmad Shah's son, I think, right? So,
Yes.
yeah, Ahmad Shah's son. He met the founder's son, but not the actual founder. So he's telling the pedigree of the history of this king that he met in Peshawar, Shah Shuja. He tells the story of this king, the story of his family, and through that, the story of the king and his family, he comes to basically tell the story of Afghanistan, right? At least the later generations took that to be the story of Afghanistan, right? And it is a very contested story, and many have pointed out the flaws in this. Many have pointed out that the colonial kind of bias in the way he has told that story. Interestingly enough, he did not really go to Afghanistan proper, that is today Afghanistan. He was remained in periphery of what at the time was the Afghan Empire. And he has a lot of kind of confusing thoughts there. For example, he uses the word Afghan and Pashtun interchangeably. He flattens a lot of diversity among the Pashtuns in a sense that even though Pashtun existed as a kind of an identity, it was much more diverse, it was much more complicated. For example, in his mind, people, many other kind of ethnic group that existed in the region were also kind of subsumed under the idea of Pashtuns. He doesn't talk a lot about the non-Pashtuns of Afghanistan, or the territory that he later came to call Afghanistan. So there are a lot of problematic kind of thoughts or concepts in his early writings, but he became very influential. And a lot of formal stories we have about Afghanistan goes back to him. He wrote 2 books called The Kingdom of Kabul, and he produced some maps that created the thought about a political entity called Afghanistan, right? Initial thought. So you should be very critical of this and be aware there's a lot of kind of critique of him. But he was very influential. So if you go with his story, or the story that he helped form, Afghanistan emerged in the middle of 18th century, where 2 regional empires were in decline. The Mughal Empire, as I said, the Muslim Empire based in India, and the Persian Empire. They're both in decline. That created a space for this person called Ahmad Shah to actually rise to power and unite the Pashtun tribes in forming what historians would call an empire of plunder, meaning that this empire was a loose confederation of tribes unified under his rule, under Ahmad Shah's rule. And the way they would find resources was to go on military expeditions to other parts of the region, mostly India or Persia, and extract resources, right? You can compare it to like a Mughal empire, right? It's kind of an empire of plunder, right? Which was very much the norm at the time. Ahmad Shah was a military officer in another empire of plunder, Afshari Empire of Plunder, and Ustad is much more knowledgeable of that about that than I am. But it was a similar empire. It was built on Turkish tribes, and they also did the same thing. They plundered the riches of India, and actually Ahmad Shah grew up as a military officer within that Afshari plunder empire. And he kind of once the Afshari, that was the Persian one, declined, he went around and kind of created his own brand, plunder of empire. Instead of Turkish tribes, he organize the Pashtun tribes. That was not all there was. He cared about building a state as well, but the state was very minimal, and you're talking a pre-modern state, so extremely small. And the way he would build this state was using the Persian political tradition, which is very much unique. I mean, right now in the world where people are trying to build political institutions, they tend to copy the West. At the time, especially in the region, the Persian political institutions were the most influential. So all the offices he created, all the kind of form of institutions he created were basic Persian in their roots, right? His bureaucracy, his state was a Persian. That was the tradition he was part of. He called himself Shah, and most of them Shah of Khorasan, like the Khorasan, which is the name that is often given to the civilization that was there, like the Persian in roots. So he did a minimal state building, mostly engaged in plunder and kind of keeping the confederation of tribes together. Islam was there as a part of the Persian kind of political tradition, but not very. We're talking about traditional Islam, meaning that he did not rule in the name of Islam. He did not really claim to fashion an Islamic state in any way. Islam was part of people's lives. The political question was somewhat distant from the Islamic question. The politics was more a realm of tribes and tribal politics than any theological or jurisprudential kind of debate. Right? So he had the kind of he was building on a Persian political tradition, not necessarily like an Islamic political tradition. Then after he died of natural causes. After he died, there was a period of decline. His empire went to decline in one generation. As I said, Al-Fistan met his son, Ahmed Shah's son. And part of the reason for decline is complicated. Major reason was that the British India rose, and that declined resources for the empire of plunder that they had. So basically, they could not raid India anymore because India was coming under the colonial influence. The British India was getting form. There were some infighting. His kind of dynasty was based on Durrani tribes. There was a rival Barakzai kind of tribe that fought with him, and they took power from him. So there was kind of a shift in political authority within the empire as well. There was kind of a civil war. There was also the increase in political influence of Islam. Right? So the Persian basis was still there; it was still influential, but there was a shift towards Islam becoming much more pronounced part of the politics. And it had to do with the fact that this rival group, the Barakzai, like the people who were trying to take over the dynasty, like in the civil war, they were fighting a Sikh force under eastern border. So the British did not take over India completely. A part of India that was bordering Afghanistan was actually ruled by Sikhs. And that Sikh empire that was kind of taking shape there was a threat to the Afghan empire. And this rival dynasty was trying to capitalize on their fight with these Sikh forces as a way to boost their own political authority in the country, as a way to maintain the integrity of the Afghan empire. So in fighting with the Sikhs, the idea of jihad and the idea of holy war and Islam and the ruler, for example, Dost Muhammad Khan calling himself the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or claiming the position that he was the Prince of Islam in fighting the non-Muslims, became much more influential. Right? You can also see how the political economy changed, so he had to use ideology a little bit more. You don't have as much political economy backing. You kind of tend to be invoking people's beliefs a little bit more. So that also happened during this time. And there were 2 times that Afghans fought the British. So that also helped kind of aggravate the Islamic sentiments, because it was a fight with non-Muslims, and especially of foreign background, European background. Despite this kind of antagonistic contact with the West, at the same time, this is a time when European technology and knowledge becomes influential. So there are some rulers set up schools, and they export experts and military experts early on from the European world, and try to kind of shape their institutions based on European models, right? This is the first time during this time that an American becomes part of Afghan politics. There's this guy from the US that was there and actually was teaching them transfer some military knowledge. So this is a time where European knowledge and technology is becoming influential as well at the same time. So there's a shift from Persian world towards the European world in terms of what you wanted your political institutions to look like. But it's still, despite Islam being invoked here and there, it was not. It's still, we're talking about traditional Islam, right? And we're talking about pre-modern state, very, very minimal state. Okay. All of that kind of changed in a very dramatic way through this act of this figure. So that period of decline ended up in Afghanistan becoming very small. So that period of decline ended in Afghanistan becoming very small, but a small nation state. So the idea of nation state became, as I said, European model was becoming influential. The Persian model was kind of fading away. And this figure called Abdurrahman Khan came to power, and he tried to consolidate power in Afghanistan and create Afghanistan in the image of a nation state. He was very much aware of the change that was happening in the world, that the world was becoming the nation, the system of nation states. So he was trying to mold Afghanistan in that space as a way to control his, expand his power in the country. And in doing that, it's kind of the first wave of modernization. He actually used Islam in a very, very explicit way. He claimed that he had a right to rule based on Islam. He claimed he was the kind of the representation of the divine law. He called for jihad or holy war against non-Muslims within Afghanistan, right? And he claimed that he was decreed to rule by God. He claimed that he was the shadow of God on earth. And all those kind of very rich kind of rhetoric of Islam was used by him. He also tried to control Islam within Afghanistan. He required, for example, that judges who were mostly, prior to him, religious scholars who were independent from the state, to pass some tests and basically controlled who could become judge in his territory. He codified Islamic jurisprudence, which prior to him were uncodified and were in books of scholars. He codified them in the first example of what is called Asas al-Quzzat, which is basically a manual for judges. So you can see how state control over judiciary is increasing, state control over religion is increasing, right? His grandson kind of went way forward with this. His grandfather was very much interested in building a state. Amanullah Khan wanted to build a state that was progressive. We are using this word anachronistically, but he wanted to change some social relationship as well. He, for example, enacted rules, his grandson, that limited polygamy, limited the child marriage. So he kind of was not only interested in building a state, he wanted to use the state to actually reshape society to a certain extent as well. Amanullah Khan, the grandson. And he's sometimes remembered as a very progressive figure in Afghan history. And you can see actually that this is a photo of Taliban taking over the Afghan palace where the president used to live. And behind him, behind that photo, you can see the painting. It's a painting of Ahmad Shah, the moment that Afghanistan was apparently founded, right? The founder of the Afghanistan empire. So that's a side note. So Amanullah Khan was this figure. He wanted to use Islam as a way to legitimize his progressive politics as well. He had Indian and Ottoman modernists who were Muslims in their outlook, but they were not really sophisticated religious scholars. They were just Muslims, and they wanted to create this new Islamic political system in Afghanistan. Because you have to remember, Afghanistan was one of the first independent nation state in the world, right? So Amanullah Khan had just gained Afghanistan independence from the Britain. So it was kind of one of the first political entity that could shape its own laws, make its own rules, right? The Muslim entity. And therefore, there were a lot of kind of pan-Islamic feelings. The Muslims, intellectuals that were in India under colonial rule, or in Ottoman, which was in decline at the time, who came to this new king, very young king, and wanted to help him create a modern state that was Islamic in its outlook. His efforts did not succeed because he wanted to reshape the society, and there was a lot of resistance from traditional forces as well as religious forces, because they saw his actions to be violations of the established norms of politics in the country. So the rulers before him had not attempted to expand their power to this extent, right? Afghanistan had its own Magna Carta. It was not based on individual rights. You know what Magna Carta is? Like, it's a British kind of constraints on document that constrained the power of the ruler in Britain. Afghanistan had its own. It was unwritten, and it was not based on individual rights. It was based on the idea that the ruler who ruled in Kabul had limited sphere of influence. He could not interfere in matters of religion. He could not interfere in social life to the extent that Amanullah Khan wanted to do. So kind of he violated those norms, the constraints of ruler that were kind of part of the Afghanistan political tradition, and he faced consequences for that. He also did not have a strong military. He had lost the British support because he had just gained independence. So there were multiple factors, but he was overthrown. There was a religious backlash. There was a traditionalist backlash to his force. What came to replace him? Amanullah Khan, for example, wrote the first constitution. So it was very progressive. He kind of tried to create a Muslim nation state with the advice of these Muslim intellectuals who had a strong pan-Islamic feeling. What replaced him when he was overthrown was a family that later came their period of rule, which was the most stable maybe in modern Afghan history. Like they ruled for like 50 years. They came to be known as Musahibin. It was a kind of a family that ruled the country. They tried to do a synthesis. They kept some of the Amanullah Khan's ideas, especially in the state. They kind of kept the form of the state and they expanded it. And they also wanted to do some reforms in the area of education, get more people with technical knowledge, but they kept it very limited. It was for the elites. They sent some elites to study in Europe, but they also tried to pacify the traditional and religious forces. So they conceded on all the controversial Amanullah Khan's reforms in issues of marriage and issues of the legal space. So they kind of tried to present a synthesis of modernity and Afghanistan Islamic tradition. Right? They tried to do a synthesis. But this synthesis was very much modern in leaning, and gradually among the elites, the modern ideas kind of became very influential, to the point that Afghanistan started to have its kind of a form of constitutional monarchy in the 1964. So those elites came to demand some sort of government of law. They wanted to constrain on the power of the king. So Afghanistan was going towards constitutional monarchy as a result of those kind of trends that took shape through education of these elites who went to Europe, and the ideas came to Afghanistan. In 1964, they adopted a very new constitution that was very modern in outlook. It's a constitution people point to that gives rights to women, even to right to vote. It enshrines the right to freedom of speech and many kind of other influential thoughts at the time. Political parties were shaping, and kind of Afghanistan was starting to become a lot more modern in its political outlook, right? So the synthesis was kind of tipping towards modernity. And in 1964, they adopted this constitution that started what many called the decade of democracy, because we had a constitutional monarchy and a prime minister. There were many prime ministers that came and went. But in this process of modernizing the country, especially modernizing the military, there was a lot, Afghan rulers kind of relied, because the West was kind of neglecting Afghanistan at the time. US was withdrawing from the world politics. This is the Truman era and such. And Afghanistan state was relying much more on kind of Soviet technical knowledge. So many of the military officers were taught in the Soviet world, and they became influential in the part of the military. The communist thought was also circulating among the people in the university. So there was kind of a left-leaning elite that had a lot of power in the state. And some of the royal families were fighting with each other. And one member of the royal family, his name was Daud Khan, was the cousin of the king, wanted to overtake the power. So he kind of relied on this leftist military forces in the country to get him to power. And it kind of even made that leftist wing even more powerful. So this leftist leaning force was raising to power in Afghanistan, and it created a backlash, first studying in universities among who became Islamists. Right? So you had the communist ideas stepping into the country, and you had Islamist ideas stepping into the country from Egypt, because military personnel went to the Soviet world to learn the military kind of knowledge and were imbued with Marxist thoughts. Many religious scholars in Afghanistan also traveled to Egypt, and they were taught there, and they were imbued with Islamist kind of the Muslim Brotherhood kind of politics. They came back to universities, they were teaching and spreading those ideas among the students in universities. We're talking about Kabul University, like one university in the capital. And so they created both camps of Islamists and the camps of communists who were fighting at the university as well. Many of the people who were the leaders of these student political movements later became the president of Afghanistan, very influential figures. So you had those intellectual fights going on. And you had the monarchists and kind of constitutional monarchists dealing with a lot of instability within the political system that was just becoming democratized, quote unquote. And outside of it, you had these young movements of left-leaning people and Islamist people fighting in the capital, in the streets of capital. As a result of this, all this came to head through a communist revolution. The communists actually came to power, and they repressed the Islamist movements and forcefully. They pushed them out of the country. Many of them went to Pakistan, and they established a communist regime in Afghanistan. The communist regime also tried to reform the society, and this time they wanted to reform it using the revolutionary leftist kind of ideology. They basically wanted to do what Amanullah Khan did, but not in an Islamist, not from an Islamic tradition point of, not from a point of view of Islamic tradition, not relying on the roots of Islamic tradition, but relying on leftists. So you can see how devastating that was to the traditional Islam in Afghanistan. That kind of unified all the forces in the country against the communists. And the first, even though that the response to the communists in Afghanistan was very much traditional, because the communists kind of violated the traditional norms of Islam and society in Afghanistan, but the leadership actually went to the Islamists. It's a funny thing. Islamists were not very influential. They were just a bunch of people, and literally a bunch of people in university in Kabul. But they can be very influential because this bunch of people in universities in Kabul were forced out by communists, prior to them actually by the king's cousin Daud Khan, and then by communists to Pakistan. And in Pakistan, they received training, they received weapons, and they also received funding. So they would basically intermediate between the world support for the Islamic resistance in Afghanistan against communists. So being put in a position of intermediation that controlled funding, their ideology became very influential in the country. It's a very interesting thing that happened, that Islamists became the ideological force in the country, whereas the actual resistance against the communist rule in Afghanistan was very much traditional in flavor, but it was because Islamists were the face of the movement to the world. They were intermediating between the world's military support and financial support for the resistance. Right? And that gave them a lot of power. And they fought the communists in a guerrilla warfare for a very long time. Finally, the communists collapsed, and the Islamists got to form their own regime for the first time. It was 1992, 1996, that period of time. They failed miserably. They had a lot of infighting. They could not really agree on anything. And that created a lot of chaos in the country. During that chaos, the traditional Islam that was kind of marginalized by Islamists during the resistance reasserted itself. So the Islamists kind of failed. The political ideology of Islam that was supposed to create this Islamic system failed, and traditionalists reasserted themselves. These traditionalists were part of the jihad before. They were part of the resistance, but they were not in like very influential positions. They became influential when the Islamists failed, and they were the Taliban. Like the Taliban were the remnants of the elements that were traditionalist in the Afghanistan's jihad against the communist Afghanistan resistance. They formed their own independent movements, and they were able to exploit the differences and infighting among the Islamists and took power in Afghanistan in a short period of time. They controlled Kabul in 1996, and they remained in power until 2001. And they had this idea that they wanted to reshape society like the Islamists did, but they were very anti-modernist, meaning that they were not to deny everything that had to do with modernity. They wanted to basically bring Afghanistan back to what they considered to be its traditional root. Obviously, their vision of Afghanistan traditional Afghan society was very much narrow. It was based on their own experiences, which often came from a particular background in the Afghan society in the South, because the movement kind of started in the South. Even though later on they had alliance with Afghans in the East as well. The Haqqani network, you might have heard of him. It is the kind of the Eastern fraction. If you have heard of the Kandahari kind of faction in today's lexicon, that is the Southern faction. The Southern faction has been very influential. But before Taliban took over Kabul the first time in the 90s, these two factions kind of formed an alliance. The Haqqanis, who was the current Minister of Interior's father, the head of the Haqqani network at the time, formed an alliance with the Southern kind of Pashtuns in Afghanistan. And they kind of created a strong Taliban force that took control of Kabul in the 1996. And they had this kind of, in their ideal restorative process, restorative project, restorative meaning putting Afghanistan back to its traditional root, that kind of denied all the influence of modernity. They, for example, banned photography, they banned TV, they banned music, they banned all sorts of books, including the Islamist books. They banned books on political Islam because they consider that to be kind of an aberration as well. So you have this kind of a nativist, reactionist traditional response. It was very, very rigid that happened, that kind of presented itself in the Taliban. Obviously, this group had inherited a group of foreign fighters who were in Afghanistan during the fight with the communists. One of those groups was Al-Qaeda, this kind of network of Arabs who were in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets, who were left over from the Jihad era. And they became a strong ally with the Taliban because Taliban were seen as these purists, these kind of upright, very, very pious people. So they had a lot of appeal to these Arabs. They had very good, strong alliance. And that groups of foreign fighters in Afghanistan attacked, obviously, the US while they were given sanctuary by the Taliban. And that kind of triggered the international engagement in Afghanistan. They came to Afghanistan. US came to Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, and established the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic was supposed to go back to the 1964 model. So it was supposed to go back to the progressive era of Afghanistan, right? In that had manifested itself in the constitutional monarchy that Afghanistan had. But obviously, it was supposed to be a little bit more progressive. It was supposed to have more liberal political values imbued in it. But it was being built by the elements, the traditional elements of Afghanistan, the ex-Jihadi leaders who were fighting the Taliban when the US intervened, because Taliban were fighting those Islamist movement in the country and the jihadist elements in the country, and US intervened on the side of the jihadist kind of Islamists to topple the Taliban. So the US, in its liberal project, was allying with these elements who were very much rooted in traditional Islam in Afghanistan, and also Islamist politics in Afghanistan. The major party was called the Jamiat, was very much an Islamist party. It was supposed to be fashioned based on Muslim Brotherhood. Obviously, everyone was hesitant of political Islam at the time because Taliban had kind of done an extreme version of it. So there was a fatigue, and everyone wanted much more freedom and openness. So their Islamic kind of tone was kind of downplayed in the moment 2001. But you had that kind of liberal external influences by the US and its allies, and also Afghan diaspora who were living in the US and Europe and came back. They were one influence, who understood Islam in a more traditional way, which means like Afghanistan is Islam as a part of being a Muslim civilization, but they're not necessarily very interested in integrating Islam in every social, economic, and political aspect of life, right? And you had some military forces, organized forces, who fought to establish, quote unquote, Islam against the communists in Afghanistan, and then they had just fought the Taliban, which were more extreme version of themselves in a way. They also became part of this project. There was a lot of money coming in, and there was a lot of hope. So I think those differences were downplayed, but there were like those differences that created a lot of issues. Over time in the Republic, the liberal wing, because it had foreign sponsorship, the money that was coming in, the political backing that was coming from outside, was going more towards the diaspora kind of progressive liberal wing of Afghan politics. But interestingly and counterproductively and paradoxically, the military wing of American presence in Afghanistan, the military wing, was much more comfortable with the jihadists. First of all, they had the background of working with them during communist and then fighting the Taliban, but also they were the one with guns, and they were much more effective in what the US thought was the war on terror. So they were better at hunting down what the US considered to be Al-Qaeda or ex-Taliban officials. So the military and CIA was working with the jihadist elements who had anti-liberal leanings. And then the Department of State and the more kind of the political wing was working with the diaspora-based liberal kind of Afghans. So Afghanistan itself was going through deep ideological divides in the Islamic Republic project. And the youth were coming in, they were being exposed to the world. The liberal values kind of enchanted some. The fact that Afghanistan was being occupied and the liberal values were pushed on Afghanistan also pushed some youth towards traditional Islam or even Islam, kind of the political Islam. They saw that as an alternative to what they considered to be a corrupt foreign imposed regime. So Afghanistan kind of youth were also divided. The political system was very divided. And obviously there was a lot of corruption going on and there was a lot of money being pumped into the system. At the same time, there was a war going on where the US was allied with anti kind of liberal elements who were supposed to be fighting the Taliban, but at the same time, they were not that much different ideologically from the Taliban, and they were much more corrupt because they were on this kind of payroll and that was corrupting influence in the country as well. All of that came down when the Taliban were able to regroup and basically fight the Republic and its foreign backers until 2021, where the foreign backers decided to remove and the Republic kind of collapsed. Taliban took over. Early on, many thought the Taliban may have been reformed. They would be different, but this time, but they have basically gone back to the 1996 model, which is kind of an anti-modern kind of version of traditional Islam. But they're doing one thing very different, because as I said, traditional Islam did not envision that the ulama or religious class would be ruling the country. There was a kind of a distance with the political issue. Taliban are kind of rewriting that. They want the religious class to be ruling the state. So they kept the nation state like the Islamists, and they want to use the nation state to change the society. So engaging in what Foucault would call subjectivity making, because they're trying to create a new society, a new Muslim, a new Afghan. They wouldn't call it a new Afghan or a new Muslim. They would call it a restorative project. They want to put Afghanistan back to its roots, right? So they call it restorative, but it's completely a new project. And they want to use the state institutions to do this, right? So very, very modern, very Islamist. They don't admit it, but that's what they want to do. But substantively, they say the rules they use to define what a good Muslim is, what a good Afghan is, comes from traditional Islam. So you have this marriage of substantive traditional Islam rule, which are pre-modern in their origin, with the modern forms of nation states. So format is the format of a state, and the format of a state-society relationship is modern. But the content according to which they want to shape the society is pre-modern and to a certain extent anti-modern, like rejection of in private spheres, the distinction between private and public, the rejection of individual rights. Those things are anti-modern. And you have this kind of a unique system in place. Maybe the closest counterpart to the Taliban version political ideology would be the Iranian version. Again, there you have a state that is modern in form, a society that is modern in its shape, but claims to have as its content the pre-modern Shia jurisprudence in the case of Iran. So you get a very uniquely oppressive regime, because what made pre-modern Islam not oppressive was the fact that Islam was much more pluralistic, just by virtue of the fact that it was not part of a nation state. It was not supposed to be a unifying force for a state. It was part of the society. The jurists were living with the society. They were managing conflicts. They were helping people live their lives, but they did not have all the instruments of power to use and to reshape the society. They complained about the ills of the society. They advised the ruler. They advised the public. They were influential. They had cultural influence, but they were not the ones with guns. What changed is Taliban basically took that kind of advisory kind of role, cultural force, and they basically put the guns on top of it. And they kind of engage in using every aspect of a state power, the public health institutions, the education institutions, and the military institution, in the service of reshaping the society and individual in the image of what they consider to be a good Muslim and good Afghan, which is very oppressive and does not really become totalitarian like it has in Iran. They're more extreme than the Iranian version. And it's very much different than how traditional Islam used to operate. In traditional Islam, a state was very limited. It did not engage in shaping people's public health issues, education issues. Education was outside the state. Health was outside of the state. Knowledge production was outside of the state. Law was outside the sphere of state control. But Taliban are using the nation-state model, which is all-encompassing and omnipresent. In terms of content, they believe they are committed to pre-modern Islamic tradition, but the way they're implementing it, the format that you're using, the way they are leveraging that makes it very different. First of all, it removes all the plurality, because if you are building a nation state based on unifying principles, you don't have time and space for differences. And at the same time, the way the Islamic tradition has influenced society, the knowledge holders, ulama, scholars influence society was very much through working with society, influencing, advising, shaping, not through guns and through holding state power. There was very much a distaste for those who were in political power in Islam traditionally, by those who were custodian of Islamic knowledge. The Taliban kind of basically flipped the script on that. So it's a very interesting kind of a modern kind of a rendition of pre-modern Islam, which makes it much more oppressive than it has ever been. Okay. I'll stop here. I hope this tour de France was helpful. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haroun, for this excellent, and nice presentation and lecture. I'm curious to ask a question before my students. From Dawood Khan premiership and from, communist coup on, the Islamic parties and the Islamic ideologies begins to marginalize the other political and ideological groups in Afghanistan. What do you think? What is the main reasons of this change, and how the Islamic ideology came to the center of the political and social structures in Afghanistan?
Honestly, I think a big part of it had to do with the Cold War. Okay. And as I said, the Islamists were not an influential factor in Afghan politics. They were a small group, and the parties you're talking about a very small group of young people who were influenced and enchanted by these ideas of political Islam that was coming from outside. They tend to be very highly educated. They tend to be based in Kabul. They tended to be students in the university, right? But this is a small group. They were agitating. For example, the person who's still alive, Hikmatyar, was a university professor. He was part of the attempt to actually overthrow Dawood Khan. They had organized some sort of what they consider to be a coup that failed, right? So it's not that they were irrelevant, but they were very much limited to Kabul, a small circle of people. And they actually, Dawood Khan pushed them out of the country. They went to Pakistan even before the communist kind of coup happened. And then communist coup happened, and everything changed, meaning that the attention of the world came to the Afghan arena because the communists got involved the Soviet got involved in Afghanistan. And these political groups that were based in Pakistan and claimed leadership of this resistance movement that was coming up in the country, who were Islamists in their kind of leaning and outlook, gained an outsized influence in Afghan politics, a kind of influence that was not proportional to their influence within the country. Why? Because they controlled resources. The money was going through them. They were given political recognition because in Pakistan they were seen as kind of the leadership of the resistance in the country, and also they were given military kind of influence and all of that, right? So you had the Islamist ideology, a few kind of elite being kind of projected onto a massive resistance movement across the country, which was much more traditional in outlook, meaning that they were resisting the communist regime for different reasons. They were not fighting for a new kind of an Islamic system where that would go around and maybe enforce hijab through the morality police. They were fighting for the traditional way of life, more or less. Because the majority of the country was rural, as you know. The majority of the country was very much attuned with its own way of life. And the communists were trying to change that. They were trying to make sure everyone goes to school. They were trying to make sure that even marriage would happen in a certain way. They changed land reform, land system. Like they kind of wanted to rewrite the whole society relationship and change the way people live their lives. They wanted to create a good revolutionary system in the country. And the country was rejecting that. They were saying, basically, we want to continue our way of life. The Islamists, I think, were equally alien to the way Afghans lived their life as Muslims and Afghans. But they became just so influential because that resistance that was coming out in the country was basically captured by the Islamists, who just happened to be in Pakistan, who happened to receive money and become the intermediary, the point of contact between the world and Afghanistan. Obviously, Pakistan also had a role because Islamists was gaining momentum in Pakistan as well. through Maududi and others, and it is a much more richer intellectual pedigree in Pakistan, which obviously prior to that was part of the Indian world. There was a lot more like rich kind of Islamist background in Pakistan, and they basically fed the Islamist political parties in Pakistan fed off of that, and it was kind of reinforcing kind of mechanism going on there that put the Islamists even in a stronger position they would have otherwise been in relation to their standing within Afghanistan. There's a famous, like, it's famous that Pakistan supported the Hizb Islami, the Hekmatyar person I referred to, because of its Islamist credentials, even though that militarily might not have had that much success compared to other forces in the country. So you have the world putting its kind of foot on the scale, Pakistan putting its foot on the scale in favor of the Islamist political parties that were based in Pakistan and intermediating with resistance inside Afghanistan.
So it means that the political Islam in Afghanistan was not a Western project.
I don't think so. I think the West, through the fight with the communists, the idea of West was that anyone who's anti-communist will support them. But the kind of idea was like, okay, in Afghanistan there are people resisting the Taliban, but who are these people, right? The US could not go to every village or every city in Afghanistan, for example, because Afghanistan was controlled by the communists. The US was engaging with the political parties that were based in Pakistan to support the resistance in Afghanistan, because these were good Muslims fighting the godless Soviet. But maybe did not have the sophistication to understand that these parties that are based in Pakistan, they're Islamist and they have a certain vision of a state-society relationship and the political vision that actually very much is anti-Western as well. Like Hekmatyar was very much anti-Western, but maybe at the time the fighting with communists was number one priority, and anyone who was kind of avowed kind of anti-communist was a friend, regardless of maybe their kind of problematic views. But I would say they knew that they were supporting the Islamist movements because they saw that maybe as an alternative to the communist regime. But within the country, the reason I think they gained a lot of influence just was due to happenstance of the Soviet invasion and the political outlook of this small clique of leaders who got dispositioned to Pakistan, got dislocated to Pakistan, and became the focal points between Afghanistan resistance and the world. The person who was fighting inside Afghanistan with the Soviet Union, with the Soviet forces and the communist regime, was fighting for his own traditional way of life. And the Islamist politics was as foreign to that life that as communists maybe be. I'm exaggerating here, but Islamists were also very much foreign. The idea of political parties was foreign in the country. The idea that you would create an Islamic system of governance was kind of very new. These people who were based in Pakistan, they were not traditional ulama. They were not traditionally trained in the civil knowledge system of the country, of Islam. They tend to be engineers, like Hekmatyar was an engineer, Ahmad Massoud, all these leaders were engineers who had different vision of what Islamist kind of a government looked like.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Yes, do you have any question? Yeah.
So you mentioned that prior to Islam becoming a political thing on the nation state level, that people were solving their problems kind of on their own. So was political Islam kind of a structure on a smaller scale in like rural communities or anything, or was it still completely separate?
Right. So I think the way to think about it is that we hadn't yet had national politics. So it would not have made sense for Islam to become a force in the national politics. But Islam was part of people's lives, but in a very small, localized scale. That means a few things. One thing, it means it was not uniform, because if it's localized, it varies from locale to locale. And second of all, it was not trying to reshape community. It was not a force for reform. It was accommodating and living and just basically coexisting with the traditions and culture of the community it was part of, right? So very much varied, very much localized, and not at all subversive, not at all reformist, not at all trying to change anything. It was actually very much reinforcing what was going on, right? It was not a force for revolution or reform in any way. What happened was that through these changes, For example, Islamists wanted to use Islam to reform the society. They wanted to Islamize the society. They thought Afghans were not Muslim enough, and they wanted to use the state to do it. That is very antagonistic. That's the opposite of how traditional Islam was part of the localized life of Afghans prior to that. Taliban are traditionalists in a sense that they come from those local religious scholars community, but they also got a taste for using the nation state, its unifying, homogenizing force, its top-down power to create their own version of good Muslims, right? Their vision is not Islamist. This vision rejects more of modernity than Islamists do, but they are equally in their method and their use of nation states for and from compared to that traditional way that Islam was part of people's lives. I'll give you an example, and it's not just Afghanistan. This is how traditional Islam was. If you have read anything from Max Weber on Islam, Max Weber was very much critical of how law operated in the Muslim context, what he called Qadi law, because he was basically making this point. It's localized, it's varied. He considered those to be negative because he thought that the law should be uniform and create predictability and certainty. So the localized, varied, highly localized way that Islam was part of conflict management, not law as a way to do social engineering, but law as a part of conflict management, was kind of how traditional Islam operated in pre-modern times. And Max Weber kind of saw that and was critical of that because he was a force for modernity and rationalism and uniformity and homogenization. But also you have to realize that that's localized, the varied way that law was operating as a source kind of conflict management tool was a great safeguard against authoritarianism. Because if you have a fragmented, localized kind of way, and law is outside the control of the state, law is just a tool for conflict management, it's very hard for any authoritarian regime to actually control the entirety of the country. You get, from some sort of communal self-rule, you don't get liberal individual rights, but you get some sort of communal rule that is very robust, and it's very much resistance to any form of top-down kind of authoritarian rule. And actually, these traditional forces were the first to resist authoritarianism, not in the name of individual rights, but in the name of communal self-governance, right? They were like, this is how we live our lives, and we don't want anyone from Kabul to tell us how to live our life. Be it Amanullah Khan, who was like a Muslim modernist, be it communists who were using Marxist ideology, be it even the Islamists. They were all equally disliked. Taliban are equally disliked as well by many communities, not because communities are not Muslim. All these communities are Muslims, but they basically are saying, let us live our lives based on our own way of living. And they resent this kind of external top-down use of a state to shape and reshape their lives. So that's kind of, I think, the way to think about it. But traditional Islam was localized, highly localized. It was not a force for reform in a sense that it was not meant to be subversive. It was very much part of a status quo and part of how things were. And at the same time, it facilitated self-governance, communal self-governance. A law was a tool for conflict management, not social engineering, because the law was not coming from the commands of the state. It was just, it's a tradition that some people get trained in, and then they come back and they try to mitigate some tension that existed between personal self-interest, the kind of conflict that exists in every community, and some higher moral demands that they believe was coming from Islam. They're very much part of society, very much conservative in a sense that they were not trying to revolutionize anything. That kind of what changed with Islamist politics. These young people in universities had these ideas that we're going to use the state to basically reform society, make people become good Muslims in a sense, right? We'll set up police force that goes around and make sure people wear hijab. We'll set up banks to make sure we make rules that make sure that banks do not give interest, right? That kind of a different flavor of Islam that emerged. Through the encounter with the communists, it was a reaction to communists. Through the encounter with modernity, because Islamists was kind of, Muslims reacted to modernity because they wanted to create a nation state like the Westerns, but they wanted to create an Islamic version of it. And in Afghanistan, the fight with the Soviets, the resistance against the Soviet, empowered this small group who were recipients of these kind of foreign intellectual influences, because they became the key points. They become the focal points in the fight against the Soviets. So they got outsized political, financial, and military power, and they kind of got their way in the country for a very long time.
Thank you.
Of course.
Another question? Even we do not have much more time. We only have 2 minutes. So, yeah.
So during the Islamic Republic, you mentioned a few groups that were fighting kind of amongst themselves during this period. What separates the traditionalist groups in that time and the Taliban?
It's a good question. The traditionalists were of the opinion that the Islamic Republic, the laws, the operations, the institutions were offending and many times the Islamic sensibility of the public. They wanted those offensive laws and practices and institutions to be moderated or controlled. For example, they were not happy that women appeared on TV without hijab. They were not happy that there were singing competitions, including women, that was going on TV. They were not happy with that. They were agitating against that. They were complaining. But they did not believe that there was a need or even an obligation to revolt against the state and in place of it create a pure Islamic system. That was not their belief, because generally they were coming from a tradition that was devoid of that kind of political philosophy, the political philosophy that basically turned Islam into a political platform, right? That's not what they had. They came from a tradition where the ulama were advising, pressuring, complaining when there were some morally wrong thing going on in the society, and the rulers were supposed to listen to them, and they basically tried to advise people to pressure the ruler, right? So you can see how it's like traditional, conservative, but it's not politically radical, right? Radical in a sense that they don't believe the right to revolution exists or the right to revolt exists, and they're not really trying to turn things upside down. Right? Taliban are traditionalists that agree with the traditional forces. There were a lot of offensive things going on in the country that need to be changed, but they were radical in the sense that they believed that the solution was for this system to be kind of turned upside down and the ulama, the religious scholars, to be put in place, and then all the resources of power should be used to implement uniformly Islam in Afghanistan. So it was not like an agitating, compromising, advising, pressuring through the existing political system, whatever the political system might have been, because they did not have an alternative. The traditional ones did not have an alternative. They would work with the king the same way they would work with the republic. Taliban were not like that. They were much more radical. They had a political vision. They had an emirate, what they called, and they wanted to replace their political system with another political system. And you can see what the difference is. The traditionalists were saying the issue is specific policies and laws that need to be reformed. Taliban were saying the issue is the political system, and we need to change the political system. That's kind of the difference. Traditionalists do not have a political system to replace the regime with. They did not feel that coming up with a political system was the job of the religious scholars. They believed the job was to advise, agitate, make sure that if there are things that are going wrong in a society, that the political rulers are going outside the bounds of what is allowed in Islam, they should really bring them into the bounds as much as possible. But the Taliban were like, no, the root cause is the political system. The root cause is democracy. The root cause is this divergence from the way the political system is supposed to operate in Islam. We get rid of this. There's a revolt component to it. There's kind of an overthrowing component, the right to revolution and the obligation to revolution and jihad is there. We get rid of this, and in place of it, we erect a pure political system that is Islamic. And that political system puts the people who are most knowledgeable of Islam in charge, and they will use all the tools available to them to implement an Islamic vision of society.